And that should have been the purpose of today's address, instead of a temporary moment of self-congratulation combined with hypnotic phrases intended to make us feel comfortable with $1 trillion of debt.
Well, I can sure say the Conservatives are not comfortable with this fiscal snapshot and the $343 billion that the government has sunk into things, and it looks like it isn't finished. Watch
spending
this.
almost exactly $1 million per minute, the least. And the only thing they had today for job creation was a new $15 million fund to staff up the Deputy Prime Minister's office. $15 million. I guess that's enough to create 150 six-figure jobs for political staffers working now for the Deputy Prime Minister. It's funny. The Auditor General asked for $11 million so that she could do her job examining all of this spending. You know, today the Auditor General is doing about 14 audits a year. 10 years ago, the Auditor General's office did 28 audits a year, twice as many. Wow. Government spending today is over $600 billion. Back then, it was about $250 billion. In other words, spending is up by more than double, and the number of audits are down by half, which means we have a quarter of the accountability. So today, we would just assumed that in this massive spending splurge, they would find $10 or $11 million for the Auditor General. Compared to the other spending they're doing, it's not very much. In fact, this government is now spending almost exactly $1 million per minute. So in the time I give my speech, they could have fully funded the Auditor General. But they did not have money for the Auditor General. They had $15 million for the Deputy Prime Minister. Now, I'm sure that later today, when I move a motion in the House of Commons, that we will shift that $15 million from the Deputy Prime Minister to the Auditor General. We will have no problem getting unanimous consent. I'm looking around and I see violent agreement from all sides of the House of Commons, and I'm sure that it will be a mere perfunctory matter of procedure to get it done when I move my motion later on.
Well, we'll skip ahead here. He does the motion. He puts it forward. Now, this is $15 billion to Chrystia Freeland's office. To her office. And the Auditor General, who's short of funds, asked for about 11. So, you know, why couldn't they fund it? Well, you know why. Because she's going to find flaws with the Liberal government plan. Watch the vote.
Resuming a point of order, the honourable member for Carleton.
I believe if you seek it, you will find unanimous consent for the following motion, Madam Speaker. Whereas the fiscal snapshot identifies, quote, increased capacity at the Privy Council office. This measure would increase the capacity of the Privy Council office to ensure that it can continue to meet its mandate following the creation of the role of Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs and International Trade, in the amount of $7 million next year and $15 million for each year after that. The House calls on the government to transfer this full sum from the office of the Privy Council to the office of the Auditor General. Thank you.
As was mentioned earlier today, we are doing things a little bit different because of the format that we are in, and therefore, at this point, I'm going to be asking all those opposed to the Honourable our members moving the motion will please say nay. Nay. And I would ask anybody virtually if anybody virtually is saying no, then if they can raise the hand on their virtual screen, that would be of assistance. So so the honourable member knows that you have to have a unanimous consent, and there is no unanimous consent.
Well, there you have it, people. The Auditor General will not be receiving the money from out of Chrystia Freeland's newly added $15 million budget. And like you said, that's a lot of employees going to be working for the Liberal campaign. Now, here next is the fiscal snapshot.
I ask all members to ensure they are in their seats and that if anyone out there is listening to this speech while operating heavy equipment, you might want to turn the volume down. The first time in history, something a government called a fiscal and economic snapshot. A snapshot is defined in most dictionaries as sort of a quick photograph, or in modern lingo, we call it a selfie, an economic selfie. But this finance minister, in talking for about 15 minutes straight, could not bring himself to utter the size of the debt or the deficit. Now, I will be the first, apparently, to do so. I ask all members to ensure they are in their seats, and that if anyone out there is listening to this speech while operating heavy equipment, you might want to turn the volume down. This government has now smashed through the $1 trillion debt mark. $1.06 trillion is the size of Canada's national debt. A deficit of $343 billion. To put that into perspective, when this government took office, the entire budget of the Government of Canada was about $260 billion. In other words, they are borrowing more in 1 year than the Government of Canada used to spend in its entire budget not long ago. Wow. Now, the finance minister went to great lengths to brag about the low interest rates that he's paying on the debt, as though he somehow set those interest rates himself, which raises questions about his perception of the Bank of Canada's independence. But what he forgets is that those interest rates are temporary, and they're only made possible by the cornucopia of cash that is coming out of the Bank of Canada, a bank which has created through keystrokes on a computer about $400 billion of new currency for government spending in less than 100 days. In other words, that's almost equal to a full quarter of GDP created out of thin air by our central bank. Now, the Prime Minister thinks he's discovered a new idea in creating currency in order to spend it. He'd best look back to history to know that this method of financing state activity can only go on for so long. I raise all of this not because the programs to support Canadians and replace the wages that governments have taken away from them are unnecessary. They are very necessary, of course. When government deprives people through lockdowns and shutdowns of their ability to earn an income, it is the government's job to compensate them for that. And such measures have been necessary and generally, with exception, supported by the official opposition. That said, we know that no nation can go on consuming without producing. The only way for us to continue to exist economically is to once again unleash the full and incomparable power of Canada's 20 million person workforce. To let free the more than 1 million entrepreneurs and businesses that employ those workers.
Your MP Poilievre really is eloquent in his speech, so we had to add the music to it, and hope you enjoy. Watch this.
And that should have been the purpose of today's address, instead of a temporary moment of self-congratulation combined with hypnotic phrases intended to make us feel comfortable with the $1 trillion of debt. We expected the finance minister would arrive here today with a plan to bring our economy back to life. Instead, what he did is brag that his plan is the most expensive plan in the G7. He said, because it consumes 10% of GDP, higher than any other G7 country and higher than the G20 average, because it spends the most money, because it is the most costly, it must therefore be the best. But of course, it has simultaneously produced the worst results. Canada now has the highest unemployment in the G7. We went into the crisis with the highest, save France and Italy, whose socialist policies this government had long been trying to emulate. But now, only 100 days later, our economic position is even worse than theirs, even worse than Italy, which bore among the hardest brunt of the COVID crisis. Today, Canada has the worst job record and posture in all of the G7. In other words, they have spent the most to achieve the least. But it is interesting that this government's only job creation measure in today's presentation was in the Deputy Prime Minister's office. So what could we do as an alternative? Well, we as Conservatives are proposing to transform the COVID programs into pro-growth, pro-job initiatives. Let's go through the list. The wage subsidy. We believed, in fact, we supported a generous wage subsidy in order to keep our workers active and contributing as much as possible during the shutdown and in the subsequent reopening. Unfortunately, though, you have to be down 30% in order to qualify for that wage subsidy. That is forcing many businesses to artificially suppress their revenues in order to continue to qualify for the subsidy. That is because their extra revenue is not as big as the wage subsidy itself. So the government is arbitrarily forcing businesses to suppress their own revenues just to stay alive. A more perverse incentive could not have been invented. And if there were such an incentive, it would be the rent subsidy, which requires revenues be down 70%. Again, the instant that business rises above that threshold, they lose the ability to pay their rent. We as Conservatives, have, under the leadership of our small business critic from Edmonton, have proposed that businesses be able to gently phase out their need for assistance by increasing their revenues and slowly decreasing their wage subsidy at the same time. Secondly, you have the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, a necessary measure, no doubt. But if this government has imposed a back-to-work penalty, if people earn more than $1,000, the Prime Minister will kick them from the CERB to the curb. We in the Conservative Party believe that we should reward work, to allow people a back-to-work bonus that will ensure that every dollar they earn, every shift they take, will make them better off than they were before. Canadians believe in work, and their government should always reward work. And that's why Conservatives have come forward with a pro-work, pro-growth agenda. We call on this government to embrace growth and jobs, to once again unleash the ferocious power of our workers and our entrepreneurs to bring our economy back to life, our finances under control, and our nation on solid footing. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Government.
Well, he really took him to task there. Now, that's how the Conservatives play it. Now, the NDP are attacking the Conservatives. I'm not sure the strategy, why it would work. Really, it's you try to topple the government. You don't topple the opposition. And maybe this is a play. Though it's a pretty good battle, and I think actually Jag has them in the end about half point. But anyway, your decision.
That is something that is somewhat problematic. When they raise a concern on one hand, it also draws a criticism on the other, and it doesn't look very good for the member or his party.
Before I go to the point of order, I do want to remind members, including the member for Battle River Crowfoot, that when someone else has the floor, that they shouldn't be shouting out or heckling during that time. I think that it's very disrespectful, and I think that every member needs to be listened to and heard, although we may not be in agreement, or you may not be in agreement with what is being said. The honourable member for Battle River Crowfoot has a point of order.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chair, and your point is well taken, and I do apologize that I do get impassioned in debate. My point of order is about referencing the attendance of members within this House. I know it was brought up a number of times during the previous COVID committee.
I'm going to rule that as a debate, and because the honourable member did not mention anybody in particular, and therefore it's not a point of order. Resuming debate, the honourable member for Battle River Crowfoot has another point of order.
Yeah, I would speak to that previous point of order that he's specifically referencing the proceedings of what he is calling movement within this House, and
I would just indicate that he did not identify anybody in particular, and therefore the point of order is out of order. The honourable député de Louis-Saint-Laurent.
The honourable member for Louis-Saint-Laurent.
Member for his speech, always interesting, and even if we disagree on maybe nearly 90% of each and every issue, I do. This is what democracy is all about. Madam Speaker, we have seen this government spending billions of dollars in the last month with the result of that. Si on regarde la situation d'aujourd'hui, Monsieur le Président.
If we look at today's situation, Canada is unfortunately the worst off among G7 countries. Highest unemployment, only G7 country to have lost its credit rating going from AAA to AA, and no plan for economic reopening. What is the vision of the NDP's leader when it comes to these issues?
All right, that was just a little interesting little banter back and forth, Conservatives, NDP. Now, here's Jagmeet Singh's long speech. Hope you enjoy. Like, subscribe, and have a good day.
Pandemic. What I want to see with the reopening of the economy is emphasis on improving our social programs, improving healthcare services, and that's how we can move forward. We have time for a brief question.
Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I've heard much from my constituents about how disappointed they are that Parliament would be shut down. And I can't help but think that it's ironic whenever the leader of the fourth party in this House tweets out, the government should be doing this, that, or the other thing. And maybe they'd be able to, except that they voted to shut Parliament down. So my question is simple. Does he regret partnering with the Liberals in shutting down Parliament?
The honourable member for Burnaby South, a brief answer, please.
Yes, well, two things. First off, it's I would just remind the member where he is right now while he's speaking. This would not have happened but for our ability to be able to bring this forward. This was something we negotiated. But secondly, the member has to be very careful. The Conservative Party talks a lot about the importance of Parliament, but if you look at their attendance record, it doesn't really show that they think that is as important. So that is something that is somewhat problematic. When they raise a concern on one hand, it also draws a criticism on the other, and it doesn't look very good for the member or his party.
Yeah. Before I go to the point of...
Speaker, I'll be sharing my time with the very honourable member from New Westminster Burnaby. Madam Speaker, throughout this pandemic, we've been focused on people. We knew that the pandemic's impact on people would be that people would not be able to pay their bills, they would be having trouble and struggles putting food on the table. And so everything we've done in this pandemic has been to push the government to deliver more help to more people. We knew in the beginning that EI would not cover enough Canadians. We know that EI only applies to 40% of Canadians, so we needed to do more than that we needed to push the government to do more than just expanding EI. And so we pushed the government to create CERB and have the amount set at $2,000 per person. And when the Prime Minister wanted to cut off CERB and leave families uncertain about the future, we fought back. New Democrats fought back, and we won. But we're not out of the pandemic yet. There's still more that we need to do. Tout au long de cette pandémie.
Throughout the entire length of this pandemic, people have had a hard time paying their bills. They are fighting to feed their families and pay the rent. And we're not yet out of this crisis, this pandemic. Families and our economy need support to keep going on.
When we fought and pushed for the extension of CERB, there are still going to be many families that can't go back to work. There is no work for many people to go back to. Our families, Canadians, and our economy, Canada, needs that support to continue. But with today's fiscal snapshot, we're going to hear from Conservatives who've already laid out and started this argument that that help to Canadians must end. We know that the Liberals will also use the fiscal snapshot as an excuse to cut help to Canadians, to families that need the help. But this fiscal snapshot, though very serious, presents a very important opportunity for a choice. The choice is this. Anytime there is difficulty, we see government after government, in this case Liberal, in the past Conservative, quickly move to putting the pressure on working families, putting the brunt of the pain on everyday families. But they never move to ask the wealthiest, those at the very top, to pay their fair share. So if the government needs to cut costs, they should cut the costs of billions of dollars in giveaways to the wealthiest Canadians. If the government needs to cut costs, and I think the government should, then it should cut the cost of allowing billions of dollars to be lost to offshore tax havens. And if the government needs to increase revenue, which I believe we need to do in this difficult time, we know there are significant companies that have made massive profits during this pandemic, Netflix and Amazon, who pay almost no tax in Canada. And we know that the wealthiest, those at the very top, continue to amass fortunes. So we asked the government to put in place a wealth tax on those who have fortunes of over $20 million. Let's ask the wealthiest to bear the brunt of the pandemic, not the families and the working people who are struggling to get by. Aujourd'hui, avec...
Today, with the economic update, we've heard the Conservatives and Liberals use it as an excuse to try and reduce the support that people are still depending on. Instead of looking for ways to reduce assistance to those who need it most, the Prime Minister and his Liberal government need to stop letting the super rich avoid paying their fair share by giving them big tax giveaways and letting them hide billions in tax havens. If the government needs to cut costs, it should cut the cost of tax havens for our economy. With better choices, the Liberal government could get the wealthiest to pay their fair share.
Let's look at the choices. In a difficult economic situation, it is time for difficult choices. But far too often, the difficult choice always seems to be to cut the programs and services that families depend on, that families desperately need. That seems to be the choice of Conservative governments and often Liberal governments, that they quickly go to cutting the services and the programs that families that are in need are desperately relying on. But instead of that choice, I put forward another choice. The government can just as well, instead of cutting the services and programs to families in need, cut the giveaways, the massive giveaways to the wealthiest. We've just heard from the Parliamentary Budget Office talking about the $27 billion or more hidden in offshore tax havens. We know that the wealthiest Canadians continue to enjoy more and more wealth. Let's do two things. End offshore tax havens. Ensure that the richest, the wealthiest Canadians, those with fortunes of over $20 million, pay their fair share with a tax on their fortunes of over $20 million, and use that revenue to pay for programs instead of cutting the services that families need. For New Democrats, the choice is clear. We will always be on the side of working people. We will always be on the side of people. We will not side with the powerful large corporations or the super wealthy. Now, throughout this pandemic, we've seen the Prime Minister and the Liberal government say some nice things. And even before, we've seen the Prime Minister and the Liberal government say some nice things. But when it comes down to it, those nice things they've said turn out to just be empty words. And I want to frame these choices and how the words of the Prime Minister have been so empty. We push the government to commit to helping Canadians who live with disabilities. And we push the government to commit to helping them without delay. Now, the Prime Minister then released a plan that does not help all Canadians, and it came months after the last thought was to help out Canadians with disabilities. They completely ignored them, and then when they provided some plan, that plan would not help all people living with disabilities. In fact, it wouldn't even help out the majority of Canadians living with disabilities. They had a choice. They could have included everyone who needed help. They had a choice to include all Canadians living with disabilities. The government, the Liberal government, had the choice and had the time to develop a plan that would help everyone in need. People getting CPP disability, veterans getting support, students, people receiving social assistance payments from provinces or territories. The choice to help making people, their choice was this. The Liberal government chose to make Canadians living with disabilities wait for help. But at the same time, where they told Canadians living with disabilities, you have to wait, you don't get to get the help you need right away, they immediately moved to help large corporations with effectively no restrictions. They wouldn't even restrict help to a company that is overtly cheating the system and not paying their fair share. To companies that use offshore tax havens, like other countries have done, they banned and they said they will not provide any help to a company that is using an offshore tax haven. Canada failed to do that. They helped big corporations that was supposed to go to working people, but instead, they didn't restrict companies receiving help to limit the bonuses paid to their CEOs to $1 million. So they're willing to give money to a company that continues to give help to the largest corporations. Lorsqu'il s'agit de ses amis bien branchés,
When it comes to his well-connected friends, the Prime Minister stops at nothing. But when it's people who are living with a disability, those individuals are waiting for this government to act.
But some quick comparables. Again, Canadians living with disabilities were told to wait, while friends of the government in We received $1 billion in a blink of an eye. The government and the Prime Minister talk about being feminist, but we know that in this pandemic, people living, women have been disproportionately impacted. And there is no recovery. There is no recovery in this economy if we don't accept the gendered lens of the impact and put forward a plan that addresses that gendered impact. And that means there is no recovery without investments in childcare.
Sorry, the time is up. I'm sure that the honourable member will be able to add during the questions and comments to anything he might have not been able to put forward. So questions and comments, questions et commentaires.
Yes. I think it's one of the things that we have to really highlight when it comes to the response of this government has been that at every step of the way, the Liberal government has tried to do as little as possible. And it was only after we pushed and fought and demanded more for people that we were able to get more for people. And it wasn't like the Liberal government was going to do it anyways, or if it was a matter of speed. It was a matter of just not understanding the severity of the problem. And again, we see that with the lack of help for Canadians living with disabilities, that was a choice. Again, we see that with the lack of real commitments to helping women return to work. Knowing that women have been disproportionately impacted, we need to make sure the recovery plan addresses that by ensuring that there is a real plan to giving financing and support to childcare, which has been devastated as a result of this pandemic. So in moving forward, we need to put forward real solutions that address the problems that people are faced with, and we know that the Liberal government won't do it unless we fight and push them to do so.
Questions and comments?
Well, again, leave your comments. Do you think that the NDP's angle is right and the Conservatives? Like, whose angle do you believe is going to force the government to do better? Have a good day.